"You ride with Cal Renner," the stage agent told me, "and you might as well dig your own hole now and save the county the shoveling." I was 16 and I had no county, no people, and 40 cents to my name, so I went and found the man instead. He was sitting his horse outside the Ledger livery in a gray dust that didn't seem to want to settle on him. Folks crossed to the far boardwalk the way water goes around a stone. I had heard the name my whole short life, Cal Renner, the last of the old breed, the gun they sent for when sending a posse meant burying half of it. Mothers used his name to frighten children. Men who'd never seen his face told stories of it anyway. And there he was, an ordinary tired-looking man with a scar that pulled one corner of his mouth down, watering a sorrel horse and minding no one. "Mister," I said, "I can cook, I can shoe, I can keep my mouth shut, and I don't scare." He looked at me a long while. "Everything scares you," he said. "You just don't know it yet." But he hired me anyway for £1.50 a month, and that was the spring my life turned over. I have lived a long time since. I'm older now than Cal ever got to be. And when people ask me, and they still do, the young ones, with that hunger in their eyes for a hard tale, when they ask me what the most feared man in the territory was really like, I tell them the truth, which is the only thing worth telling at my age. I tell them I watched that man lay his rifle down in a running river and walk away from it, and I tell them it was the bravest thing I ever saw a person do. But I am getting ahead of the story, the way old men do. We rode north out of Ledger 3 days after he took me on, into country I'd never seen. The plains rolled up green that year, sweetgrass bending silver under the wind, and ahead of us the land folded down into a long shallow valley with a creek bed cut through it like a seam. Cal didn't talk much on the trail. He had a way of looking at a thing, a ridge, a rider far off, the bones of a dead steer, that made you feel he'd already counted everything that could go wrong with it. The second night out he cleaned a rifle he never let me touch, working oil into the action by firelight, and he said, without my asking, "We're going to put some people off a piece of ground, a sa. Ardle Cattle wants it. They're paying me to make the people leave." "What people?" "Doesn't matter." He sighted down the barrel at the dark. "It never matters who, that's the trade." I didn't sleep well. I told myself a man who'd been alone as long as I had couldn't afford to be choosy about who fed him. I told myself the people would just go, the way people did when Cal Renner rode up, and no harm would come of it. I was 16, and I believed what was easy to believe. We came down into Sweetgrass Valley the next afternoon, and the first thing I noticed was that the creek was wrong. You could see it had been a good creek once, a wide green channel, willows leaning, the banks beaten smooth by 100 years of feet and hooves. But there was no water in it, just a string of muddy holes drying to cracked plates and dead minnows silvering in the sun, and the willows going brown from the bottom up. Above the valley, where the country pinched into a draw, somebody had thrown up a dam of brush and rock and raw earth, and the water that should have come down to the valley was spread out behind it in a flat brown lake that watered nothing but ardle grass. And below the dry creek in the valley itself were the people. A scatter of lodges and a few log houses, garden plots gone yellow and curling, a horse herd thinner than it ought to be, children carrying water up from a far spring in pails too big for them. I counted maybe 60 souls. They watched us come the way you watch weather, knowing it'll do what it'll do, fixing where to stand. A woman walked out to meet us. Not the oldest, not a man, not anybody sent ahead to parley while the real leaders hid. She came out alone into the open with her chin level and her hands empty, and she stopped square in our road so that Cal had to rein up or run her down. She wore a faded blue dress and her dark hair in 2 plaits, and she was maybe a few years older than the youngest of us and 100 years steadier than all of us put together. She looked at Cal's face and then at the rifle scabbard under his knee and then back at his face, and she did not flinch. I want to be plain about that because I had never in my life seen it. Grown men dropped their eyes from Cal Renner. She held his like she was reading something printed there. "You're the gun the company sent," she said. "It wasn't a question. Renner." That's the name. I'm Winona. She didn't offer the rest of it, she didn't have to. You've come to make us go. That's the job. Then I'll save you a day's work. She turned and walked, and after a moment when neither of us moved, she looked back over her shoulder and there was nothing soft in it. Come and look at what you're being paid to do. A man ought to see the thing before he does it, or are you afraid to? I will tell you, no one had spoken to Cal Renner like that in 15 years and lived to brag on it. I waited for the cold to come over him, the stillness I'd been warned about. It didn't. Something else moved in his face, something almost like a man hearing his own name called from a long way off. He swung down off the sorrel, handed me the reins, and followed her into the dying valley on foot. She showed him the creek first. She walked the dry channel and named what had been there, the trout that fed them in spring, the willows they cut for lodge frames, the watercress, the deep hole where the children learned to swim. She showed him the gardens, squash and corn and beans laid out in the Three Sisters way her grandmother had planted them, every leaf curling for want of water. She showed him the spring 2 miles off where the women now hauled from, and the blisters on a small girl's hands from the pail's wire handle. She didn't weep and she didn't beg. She reported it, the way you'd report a crime to a man you weren't sure wasn't part of it. The company built that dam in March, she said, diverted the creek onto their range. They know we can't hold without water. They know we won't shoot first because if we do, it gives them their reason and the army comes. So they're patient. They'll dry us out by August. And if that's too slow, she looked at the rifle on the sorrel, far back where I held it, they send a man like you. You hold this ground by what right? Cal asked. His voice had gone careful. For the first time something flickered in her, not fear but a kind of bitter humor. By the only kind that's supposed to matter. There's a paper. My grandfather has carried it for 30 years. She studied him. But you didn't ask because you wanted to read it. You asked because the company told you we were squatters with no right at all, and you're finding out that isn't true, and now you're wondering what kind of man you've signed on to be. He didn't answer her. I think that was the first time in a long time the man hadn't had an answer. That night Cal didn't lay out his bedroll. He stood at the edge of our little fire with his back to me, looking down into the valley where a few small lights burned, and when I woke deep in the dark he was still standing there, and the rifle was across his arms, and he was looking at it like it was a thing that had been handed to him by mistake. In the morning he went down and asked to see the paper. The old man who held it was Winona's grandfather, a man called Henry Cloud, which was the name a mission school had hung on him as a boy, and which he wore the way you wear a coat that was never quite yours. He was thin and bent, and his eyes had gone milky at the edges, but they fixed on you sharp enough through the middle. He had a dry, slow way of talking, and a habit of laughing, just a breath of it, at things that weren't funny to anyone but him. So, he said when Cal ducked into the lodge, the famous one, we've been waiting on you the way you wait on the first hard frost. Sit. You make the door dark. Cal sat. Henry Cloud took from a parfleche a folded square of paper worn soft as cloth, opened it with the care you'd use on a wound, and laid it on the ground between them. It was an allotment, a federal grant of the valley to the band, signed and sealed, the ink brown but the words plain. The valley was theirs in law. I learned later it had been signed by men long dead, in exchange for ground they'd given up elsewhere, and that such papers were honored exactly as long as nobody powerful wanted the ground. The company has a paper too, Henry Cloud said, a newer one. It says this valley was abandoned and open to claim, and that Royce Ardle claimed it, and that we are trespassing on his charity. He breathed his small laugh. We did not abandon anything. I have not left this valley in 40 years, but their paper is in the courthouse in Ledger, with a judge who eats at Ardle's table and ours is in an old man's hands. You see how it goes. Cal looked at the two papers a long time, the real one and the story of the false one. Then he asked the question I'd been too young to know was the only question that mattered. Why hire me? If they've got the courthouse, they've got the law. They could send the marshal. Because the marshal would have to find a crime, Henry Cloud said, and we have committed none. So they need us to commit one or to run or to die quiet. A scared people might shoot, that's the crime they want. A scared people might run, that's the cheap way. And if we do neither, the old eyes lifted to Cal's, a feared man might do quietly what the law can't do loudly. They are paying for your name, Renner, not your gun, your name. They think the sight of you will do their work, and no one will ever have to answer for it. He folded the true paper back into its softness. Was that the answer you wanted, or only the true one? Cal stood. He thanked the old man, which I'd never heard him do, and he came out into the light with a face like a closed door, and we rode back up to our camp on the rim. And there we sat for 3 days. He didn't drive anybody off. He didn't ride for Ledger to tell Ardle the job was done. He just stayed, watching the valley dry, and I watched him, and I started to understand that the most dangerous man in the territory was wrestling with something he had no practice at, and that it was tearing him slowly in half. On the second of those days, a girl came up from the valley, the same small girl whose hands had blistered on the water pail. She couldn't have been 7. She walked right up to our fire, set down a flat basket, and announced with the gravity of an ambassador that her grandmother had sent fry bread because a man who watched all day and ate jerky must have a poor cook. Then she looked at me, identified me correctly as the poor cook, and giggled and ran off down the slope. Cal ate the fry bread. I saw something happen to his face when he did. I didn't have a word for it then. I have one now. It was shame, the good kind, the kind that means a man's heart hasn't died after all. It was Winona who came up the 3rd evening. She climbed the slope alone in the long light and stood at the edge of our fire the way Cal had stood at the edge of it the first night, and she said, "You're still here." "I'm still here. Either you're working up your nerve to do it or you're working up your nerve not to." She sat down, uninvited, across the fire from him and pulled her shawl around her and looked at me. "Boy, walk the horses. This isn't for 16-year-old ears." I walked the horses, but I'll tell you a thing about being 16 and curious in open country with the wind from the right direction. You hear more than your elders think. I heard most of it. And what I didn't hear that night I heard later. In the years I came to be something like a son to the both of them, when the talk turned soft and backward the way it does by old fires. So I can tell you what passed between them, and I'll tell it true. She asked him why a man got to be what he was. Not cruel about it, she asked it the way you'd ask why a river ran the way it did, wanting to know the country it had cut through. And Cal, who I never once heard tell his own story to a living soul, told it to her. He'd been a young man in a range war 30 years gone, on the side that paid, which was the side that won, the way it usually is. He'd been good with a gun the way some men are good with horses or numbers, a thing he was born to and never chose. And one cold morning he'd been sent after a man, a homesteader. The company called him a rustler. And he'd done what he was sent to do, fast and clean, before he learned that the man had been no rustler at all. Only a poor stubborn farmer who'd watered his stock at the wrong creek and wouldn't be frightened off. The company had used Cal to make a problem disappear, and the law had looked the other way because the company owned the law, and Cal had taken his pay and his growing name and ridden on. And then he'd done it again, and again, for years, telling himself each time that it wasn't his to judge who deserved what, that the trade was the trade, that a gun is just a tool and points where it's aimed. And every one of them, he said, was a man somebody wanted gone and nobody wanted to answer for. I was the answer they didn't have to give. I was the thing you hire so your hands stay clean. He was quiet a while. There was a man rode with me back at the start, Tom Sennett, better than me, kinder than me. He saw it before I did what we were. He tried to talk me out of the trade. I wouldn't hear it. He rode off and got himself killed doing honest work in a mine cave, which is a thing I think about, that he had to leave me to find a way to die clean. The fire popped. I'm 49 years old. I've got no people, no ground, and a name that does the work of a noose for any rich man who wants to hang a poor one without dirtying the rope, and I rode in here to do it again. He looked across the fire at her. And I find out the squatters are a people with a paper older than the courthouse, and a woman who won't drop her eyes, and a little girl who brings the hired killer bread because she's worried he'll go hungry. And I can't do it, Winona. I came up here to do it, and I have been sitting on this hill for 3 days because I would sooner shoot off my own hand than point it at this valley. So, that's the man I am, or was. I don't rightly know which anymore. I have heard a great many men make a great many speeches in my long life, in courtrooms and pulpits and over graves. I never heard one truer than that, told to a near stranger across a small fire on a dark hill, by a man who'd never told it before and didn't expect to be forgiven for it. Winona didn't forgive him. That wasn't hers to do, and she was too honest to pretend it was. But she didn't fear him, and she didn't pity him, and after a while she said something that I've carried 60 years. My grandfather says a man is a riverbed, she said. The water runs through him whatever shape he's cut. You were cut for cruel water a long time, that's true, and it can't be untrue. She poked the fire. But a riverbed can be recut. It takes a flood, usually, something bigger than the channel. She stood, drew her shawl close, looked down at him. I don't know if you're worth saving, Renner. That's not my work, and I won't lie and say I do. But there are 60 people in that valley who didn't ask to be a test of your soul, and they're going to lose their water in August whether you find your conscience or not. So if you've got a conscience, I'd be obliged if you'd hurry it up. We don't have until the frost. And she walked back down the hill, and Cal Renner sat looking at the fire, and I came back with the horses, and he said to me, not looking up, "Asa. In the morning we're riding to Ledger." And something in how he said it made my stomach go cold and bright at once, because I knew, the way you know a storm is coming by the smell, that the man had made up his mind about something, and that nothing in the territory was going to stop him doing it. The Ardell Cattle Company kept offices in the best building in Ledger, a square brick thing with the name in gold on the glass. Royce Ardell was a big, soft-handed man who'd never roped a steer in his life, but owned 40,000 of them, and the grass they ate, and most of the men who voted in the county. He had a way of smiling that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. He stood up when Cal came in and put out his soft hand, and called him by his first name like they were old friends, and asked, was the valley business concluded? "It's concluded," Cal said. Ardell's smile widened. "They've gone, then. Good. I knew your reputation would do most of the—" "They haven't gone anywhere," Cal said. "I have. I'm giving back your money." And he laid the company's advance on the desk, gold double eagles in a neat stack, and Ardell looked at it like it was a snake. "I want you to understand what was in that room." Ardell had 2 men with him, hard cases, not as hard as they thought, and there was the open door behind us and the whole company town beyond it, and Cal Renner had just handed back blood money to the most powerful man in 3 counties and called him, by implication, a thief and a coward. The temperature of the room dropped about 30 degrees. Ardell sat back down slowly. "I see," he said. "Your conscience has discovered itself. How inconvenient." He folded his soft hands. "You understand, Renner. This changes nothing for those people. The valley is going to be cleared. The creek stays where I put it. I'll have a dozen men up there inside a week, and they won't have your scruples, and there'll be a fire or two and a scare, and the Indians will leave the way they always leave, and the law will write it down as voluntary. Your little crisis of feeling buys them nothing but a slower death." He smiled again. "It does buy you something, though. It buys you an enemy. I'd have given a great deal for your name on my side. Now it's against me, and that's a thing I can't allow to walk around free. You understand business, surely. You've been on the collecting end of it your whole life." "I understand it," Cal said. "Then you understand that the most feared gun in the territory, suddenly grown soft over a creek full of mud, is worth more to me dead than alive. As a lesson, as a notice posted to anyone else who might catch a conscience at the wrong time." Ardell's eyes finally reached his smile, and it was an ugly meeting. "Ride out of the county, Renner. Tonight. Take the boy. Don't go back to that valley. Because if you stand in front of it, I'll bury you in front of it, and I'll have men enough to do it that even you can't shoot them all. That's not a threat. It's a sum. I've done the arithmetic. You're one man. Cal looked at him a moment. Then he picked his hat up off his knee and stood. You've done the arithmetic, he agreed, but you left out a number. He set his hat on his head. You figured me for one man standing alone in front of that valley. I'm not going to stand in front of it. He turned for the door, and in the doorway he stopped, the light hard around his shape, and he said the thing that I have repeated more times than any other words in my life, because it was the whole turning of the man in a single breath. I'm going to stand in it, with them, and a man defending his own home is a different sum than a hired gun, Ardle. You ought to know that. It's the one piece of arithmetic your kind always gets wrong. And we walked out into the street, two of us, with the whole company town watching, and we got on our horses and rode north toward the valley, and behind us I could feel the brick building like a held breath, and I was so scared I could taste copper, and so proud I could have flown. We rode back into Sweetgrass the next day, and Cal Renner did not go to Winona and offer her his gun, the way it would happen in a cheap story. He went to Henry Cloud, the old man, the one who held the paper, and he sat down in the lodge and he said, "Grandfather, I quit the company. I gave back the money. Ardle means to clear this valley with a dozen men inside the week, and he means to kill me for changing sides, and I've come to ask if I can stand with you. Not to lead, to stand. It's your fight and your ground, but I'm a fair hand at this particular kind of trouble, and I've got it coming to me to spend on the right side for once. So I'm asking your leave." Henry Cloud looked at him for a long time with those sharp old eyes in their milky rims. Then he breathed his small laugh. "The famous one asks an old man's leave to fight," he said. "Well, the world turns over after all." He reached out and, to my astonishment and Cal's, patted the back of the gunman's hard hand the way you'd gentle a horse. "You may stand with us, Renner, but you'll do it our way. We didn't last on this ground by being brave. We lasted by being right and by being patient and by making the powerful pay a higher price than the thing was worth to them. My granddaughter will tell you how. She has been telling me how for months, and she is usually correct, which is very annoying in a young person." He raised his voice without raising it. "Winona. She must have been just outside because she came in at once and looked at Cal sitting there in her grandfather's lodge having asked leave to fight, and something passed over her face that I was too young to name but that I have come to understand was the beginning of the thing that lasted them the rest of their lives. Not softness, recognition, the look of a person who has found, against all sense, a worthy one. "You came back," she said. "I came back. To stand in front of us. To stand in it," he said. "With you. Your grandfather says it's your plan. I'd like to hear it. And here is the part of the story that the cheap tellers always get wrong, and that I am old enough now not to. Because the cheap tellers want the famous gun to save the helpless Indians, and that is not what happened, and the truth is better. The plan was Winona's. It had been Winona's for months. She had seen, before any of them, that the band could not win the fight Ardle wanted, the shooting fight, the running fight, and that the only fight they could win was the one Ardle was sure they couldn't reach, the fight over the truth. She had, that whole spring, while the creek dried, been quietly building a case. She had the true allotment paper, her grandfather's, but she had understood it wasn't enough against a courthouse Ardle owned, so she had gone further. She had walked the dam herself and counted the company brands on the men who built it, and she had names. She had found the surveyor's stakes the company had moved, and dug up where the old true ones had been, and could prove the line. She had 2 settler families downstream, white families, who Ardle had also robbed of water and who hated him cordially, willing to swear to the creek's old course. And this was the master stroke. This was the thing. She had not trusted the local court at all. She had written, months back in a careful hand, to a federal land agent 200 miles east, a man with no love for the company and a reputation for honesty, and she had laid the whole fraud before him with the paper's number and the dates, and she had been writing him every week since, and he had written back that he was coming, that a federal allotment couldn't be voided by a county court, that Ardle's claim was very likely a forgery and forgery was a federal crime, and that he would arrive, God and the weather willing, within the fortnight. That was the flood, you see. That was the thing bigger than the channel. So I don't need a gun to win, Winona said to Cal Renner plainly in her grandfather's lodge. I need to live long enough for the agent to get here. Ardle knows that too. Somehow, he's pushing his timetable. He needs us gone or dead before a federal man can stand in this valley and write down what he sees, because once that's written, the company's paper isn't worth the ink. So the fight isn't to beat his dozen men. The fight is to hold this valley without firing first, without giving him his crime for 2 weeks. That's all. 2 weeks of not dying and not breaking. Can the most feared gun in the territory help me do that, not by killing, but by making it cost Ardle too much to try? Cal Renner was quiet a moment, and then he smiled, the first true smile I ever saw on him, and it changed his whole hard face. Ma'am, he said, making it cost too much is the only thing I was ever any good at. He looked at the old man and back at her. You don't need my gun, you need my name. Same as Ardle did. The difference is I'd be lending it instead of selling it. He leaned forward. Here's how you turn a feared man to a fence. You don't hide me. You stand me out where every one of Ardle's hired hands can see me, and you let his arithmetic do your work. Every man he sends up here knows the name. Every one of them was figuring on scaring off Indians who wouldn't shoot back. Now they have to figure on Cal Renner standing in the open on the right side of the law for the first time in his life, with a federal agent 2 weeks out and a forgery charge waiting. I won't have to fire a shot. I'll just have to be seen. Cowards do sums, Winona. Let's give them a bigger number than they want to pay. And Henry Cloud laughed his small, dry laugh and said, I told you she was usually correct. And Winona looked at Cal Renner across her grandfather's lodge, and I swear the air between them changed. And that was the day, I think, though neither of them would have admitted it for a long while yet. The 2 weeks that followed are a story by themselves, and I will not tell all of it, because we are old friends now, you and I, sitting at this fire, and you'll want the heart of it and not every cold night. Ardle's men came as he'd promised. Not all at once, he was too careful for that, and our number had changed his sums. They came in 2s and 3s, scouting, testing. The first riders crested the rim expecting a frightened camp and found instead the band standing easy in the open, and sitting his sorrel horse out front of all of them where the morning sun lit him plain, the most feared man in the territory, doing absolutely nothing. Which was the most frightening thing he could possibly have done. The riders looked a long time. Then they turned around and rode back, and one of them, I heard later, told the bunkhouse that night that he hadn't hired on to face Cal Renner over a creek and drew his time and quit. That was the first number Ardle lost. Cal taught us those days. Not how to shoot, Winona had forbidden it, and she was right. A single shot from our side was the one thing that could undo everything. He taught us how to be seen, how to stand so a watching man counts you as more than you are. How to mend the creek gate so the little water that seeped past the dam went to the gardens that needed it most. How to read dust on the horizon and know how many were coming and how fast. And in the teaching, the man changed in front of my eyes, day by day, like a riverbed recutting. He fixed things. That was the surprise of him. The famous gun turned out to have hands that wanted more than anything to mend. He rehung a door that had sagged since winter. He patched a roof. He taught the blistered-handed girl, her name was Mapia, and she had decided Cal belonged to her, how to rig the water pail so the wire wouldn't cut, and then he made her a wooden handle on his own, whittling it of an evening by our fire while she supervised with great seriousness. He shared his rations down to nothing and ate what the band ate. He sat with Henry Cloud in the long dusks and listened to the old man's stories, really listened. The way a thirsty man drinks about the valley before the dam, the trout in the deep hole, the winters and the dead and the living. I think those evenings did something for Cal that no amount of pay ever had. I think, listening to an old man love a place that hard, he learned for the first time what a home was, and understood the size of what he'd spent his life helping other Ardles take away. And Winona. They worked side by side those 2 weeks the way two people do when they've stopped pretending they're not watching each other. She'd catch him fixing a thing nobody'd asked him to fix, and the corner of her mouth would lift. He'd watch her face down a scared mother or a doubting elder with that level chin and those unflinching eyes, and something in his own hard face would go quiet and full. One evening I found them at the dry creek bed, not touching, just standing, looking up at the brown lake behind the dam, and Cal said, "When the agent comes and they make Art'll tear that dam out, and they will, you'll have your creek back inside a day. The deep hole'll fill by week's end. The children'll swim by the next moon." And Winona said, "You sound very sure for a man who's lost every fight he was ever paid to lose." And Cal said, "I'm not on the paid side anymore. I notice we win different over here." And she laughed, the first time I'd heard her laugh, and it was a young sound, surprised out of her, and Cal Renner looked at her like a man who'd found water in a country he'd given up on. Art'll made his real push on the 11th day, when he could no longer pretend the agent wasn't coming. He sent 8 men up the valley in the gray before dawn, with lit torches and a hard purpose, meaning to burn the lodges and the gardens and provoke the one shot that would turn the whole thing into the Army's business and the courthouse's verdict. It was the closest thing to violence in the whole affair, and I'll tell it short, the way Cal always told the worst things. They came in fast and spread, and our people did not run and did not shoot, the way Winona had drilled into every soul over 50 and under 10. The men with torches checked up when they saw the band standing firm, and then they saw Cal, afoot now, walking out to meet them alone in the half-light with his rifle held crossways in both hands, not aimed, just held, and his voice came across the dark flat and even. "First man drops a torch, starts a fire, I'll have to answer to a federal court for, and so will every man who watches him do it, and I'll be standing right here to say your names. There's an agent on the road. You boys want to be the men he writes down for arson on federal land. Art'll let you hang for it and sleep fine. Think on your sums." And then, and this is the part Mapia told for the rest of her life, because she watched it from a lodge flap, the lead writer lifted his rifle and put it on Cal, and Cal just stood and looked at him, and didn't lift his own, and said, "Quiet now. I've been on your end of this 100 times, son. Killing a man over another man's grass. I'm telling you it's the worst thing you'll ever carry, and it won't even be yours, it'll be Art'l's, and he won't carry an ounce of it. Go home." And the rider held a long, long moment. I have never breathed slower in my life. And then he lowered the rifle and turned his horse, and the 8 of them rode back down the valley with their torches guttering out, and not one shot was fired, and the garden stood, and the lodges stood, and the band stood, and we had held. The federal agent rode into Sweetgrass Valley 3 days later, a plain, dusty man with a satchel of papers and a clerk and a deputy marshal who answered to Washington and not to Art'l. Winona met him the way she'd met us, alone, chin level, except this time she had under her arm a case so complete, so patiently built, that the agent told her, I heard, that he'd never in 20 years been handed a fraud so thoroughly proven by the people it was worked against. The moved survey stakes. The dam and the men's names who built it. The settler family's sworn word. The true allotment, browned and soft, signed by dead men but binding still. And the company's claim, which proved, under the agent's reading, to be forged, a federal crime, exactly as he'd written her it likely was. It took weeks to grind through, the way such things do, but the end of it was never in doubt after that day. The company's claim was struck. The judge who ate at Art'l's table found himself the subject of a separate inquiry. Royce Art'l was ordered to tear out the dam at his own cost and to restore the creek, and he was charged besides. And though a man that rich is hard to hang, and he never did hang, his arithmetic had failed him at last, and he left the county within the year a smaller man than he came. And the dam came out, brush and rock and raw earth, and I was there the morning the water came back down the channel, a thin brown rush first, hesitant, finding its old bed, and then clearing, and then running full and cold and singing over the stones it remembered. The willows greened from the bottom up, the deep hole filled. And by the next moon the children swam in it, Mapia the loudest of them, and Henry Cloud sat on the bank in the sun with his feet in the cold water, laughing his small, dry laugh that wasn't small at all that day. And Winona stood beside Cal Renner watching the children, and her hand found his, and he did not flinch either. There's a thing I haven't told you, and it's the thing the whole story is named for, and I saved it because it was the moment I understood the man. It happened the morning the dam came out before the water reached us, when the others were upstream watching Ardle's crews tear the thing down. Cal walked down to the dry creek bed alone. He didn't know I followed. I was a boy and I followed everything, and he stood in the cracked channel where the water was about to return, and he took the rifle off his shoulder. The famous rifle, the one I was never allowed to touch. He held it a while, the way Henry Cloud held the paper, the way you hold a thing that's been the whole shape of your life. And then he knelt down and laid it in the bottom of the creek bed, in the deepest part of the channel where the water would run swiftest. And he stood up, and he stepped back, and he left it there. I came out of the willows. "Cal," I said, "you're leaving your gun." "I'm leaving it," he said. "The water'll ruin it." "That's the idea." He looked down at it, lying clean and oiled in the dust that wouldn't be dust much longer. "I've carried that thing 30 years, Asa. It's killed men who didn't deserve it for men who didn't deserve them. It's done everything a thing can do that's wrong. And the one good thing it ever did, it did by not going off out there against those torches when I held it crossways and didn't lift it." He was quiet. "A man can't carry a thing like that and be the kind of man she'd have. And I find I'd rather be that kind of man than be the one the territory was afraid of. So," he nodded at the creek bed, "it can rust here. Let the water have it. I won't need it again. Whatever comes, I'll meet it the way honest men do, with my hands and my neighbors and what's right." He put his hand on my shoulder, which he had never done. "Don't ever pick up a thing like that, boy. The name it earns you isn't worth what it costs to earn it. Took me 49 years and a dry creek and a woman who wouldn't drop her eyes to learn that. I'm telling you for free." And then the water came. We heard it before we saw it, that singing rush coming down the channel, and Cal Renner took my arm and we climbed up the bank, and the creek filled in below us and it covered the rifle, and the green water ran over it and on past, going where water goes, and we never saw the gun again. It's down there yet, I expect, 60 years of silt over it, rust to nothing by now. The willows lean over that spot. The children, other children, grandchildren of those children, still swim in the deep hole below it. None of them know there's a famous rifle in their creek, and that's exactly right. That's exactly how it ought to be, that the most dangerous thing in the territory is buried under the gentlest, feeding willows and minnows and the laughter of children who never had cause to learn the name Cal Renner. He married her that fall, in the band's way and then in the law's way both, so no court could ever question it, because Winona was always thinking 3 moves past everyone, and a marriage in 2 laws is harder to break than 1. Henry Cloud gave his blessing. He'd been giving it with his eyes since the night in the lodge, and he lived to be very old, long enough to teach Cal every story of the valley, and to laugh his small laugh at how badly the famous gun took to gardening, and how doggedly he kept at it anyway until the corn came up straight. Cal Renner spent the rest of his life in Sweetgrass Valley, and he never wore a gun again, and the only iron his hands knew was a plow's and a hammer's and a fishing hook he carved for the children. And he was, I think, until the day he died, quietly amazed at his own luck. They had 2 children of their own and raised 3 more that came to them needing raising, and they raised me near enough, who'd come there a scared boy of 16 behind the wrong man, and stayed a son of the valley behind the right one. I have stood at both their graves, up on the rim where you can see the whole green length of the valley and the creek running through it like a seam mended. They're side by side. The stones don't say, "the most feared gun in the territory." They say his name, plain, and hers beside it, and the years, and that's all, and it's enough. I am the last now who remembers him as he was when he rode in, the gray that wouldn't settle, the men crossing the street, the name like a noose for hire. And I have outlived all of it on purpose, I think, so that I could be the one to set the story straight before I go. Because the territory remembers Cal Renner wrong. It remembers the terror and forgets the turning. And the turning was the whole of him. So when the young ones come and ask me, with that hunger in their eyes, what the most feared man in the territory was really like, I take them down to the creek. I show them the deep hole and the leaning willows and the green water running cold over the stones it remembers. I tell them there's something down there under 60 years of silt, that a hard man laid down so he could pick up a softer life. And I tell them what Winona told him by that small fire on the hill, the thing that turned him, the thing I have carried longer than I've carried anything, that a man is a riverbed cut for whatever water runs him, and that the water can run cruel a long, long time. But that a riverbed can be recut if a flood comes that's bigger than the channel, and love is a flood. And it came for the hardest man I ever knew, late and against all sense, and it recut him clean, and he ran sweet the rest of his days. That's what he was really like. Lay your ear to the creek some evening when the children have gone in and the willows are still. You can almost hear it. The water, running over a thing that used to be terrible, going gentle now, going home.